Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back, and we will resume our session now. We will resume our discussion of Section 4, and we have a number of speakers still to go on the list. So as it stands at the moment, we've got Netherlands, followed by Chile and Mexico, and followed by the Holy See. So we'll take them in that order, and of course, if anyone else wishes to intervene, just indicate. So on that basis, we'll start up now, and I'll give the floor to Netherlands. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, but I spoke just before lunch, so in fact, Chile, Mexico.
Well, there you are. My excuse is that I wasn't here, but I don't know what my colleague's excuse is. Anyway, thank you very much. Thanks. Well, then we'll go to Chile, Mexico.
I have a mic? Yes? Okay. Thank you, Chair. Hope you had a good lunch. Again, thank you, Chair. The delegations of Chile and Mexico have the following comments regarding Section 4. At the outset, allow us to express that in our view, the commitments of this section are susceptible to be strengthened in terms of what needs to be done in order to effectively address the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. We do nevertheless understand that what is key in this declaration, and as has been highlighted by other delegations previously in the morning, is its follow-up process. We agree with France and Germany when they state that the political declaration is not an end in and of itself, but it is the spark of a consultation process with the aim to improve compliance with IHL through the change of behaviors and the sharing of best practices with a view of effectively addressing the humanitarian consequences of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Our specific comments are the following. On 4.1, in general terms, as we have proposed in other sections, there should be a clear linkage between the proposed commitments and the core objective of the political declaration. In this regard, we would suggest the following drafting. Strengthen international cooperation and assistance among armed forces and other relevant stakeholders with respect to exchanges of technical, operational, and tactical expertise and humanitarian impact and battle damage assessments with regards to the use of explosive weapons, in particular with wide area effects, in order to develop good practices to better protect civilians. We are of the view that the reference to battle damage assessments should be included in this paragraph rather than in paragraph 3.4. This is with the purpose of having a holistic approach towards the identification of good practices that includes both battle damage and humanitarian impact assessments. We will come back to this in Section 3. We greatly value the importance of other stakeholders beyond armed forces to strengthen international cooperation and assistance. We consider those stakeholders to include not only the broad variety of state actors, but also other actors as the ICRC, international organizations, and civil society. 4.2, as mentioned in paragraph 1.6, data collection, tracking, and sharing should go beyond the recording of civilian casualties and should include other critical aspects, as has been highlighted in the morning by other delegations. For example, the type of explosive weapons used, the areas affected, as to consider if they produced wide area effects, the types of direct and indirect reverberating effects, and the impact on intended targets. In our view, these additions would ensure that data collection serves its purpose and that of the declaration. We acknowledge that there has been a recognition of practical security and legal constraints for achieving the data collection, tracking, and sharing. Therefore, we would be open to accept that is conditioned to when they are feasible. However, the caveat as appropriate should be deleted as it is too discretionary and lacking of clarity. Finally, we recognize that this is a paragraph that should not be restricted to explosive weapons with wide area effects, but as it does now correctly references to explosive weapons in general, as to be able to identify which are the ones that could be considered to have wide area effects and are particularly harmful to the civilian population. 4.3, we welcome the more precise commitment to facilitate the work of the UN, the ICRC, relevant international organizations, and civil society, aimed at collecting data on the impact on civilians of military operations involving the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. We consider that the term as appropriate should be deleted, or at least should not be referred to all those actors in general as a single category. This comment also applies to the use of the term as applicable in paragraph 4.5. 4.4, as indicated in our opening remarks, we welcome the much broader concept of victims that includes those injured, survivors, family members of people killed and or injured and affected communities. However, we consider that the paragraph should be descriptive of the type and scope of measures of assistance required: medical care, sanitation, critical in times of pandemics, psychosocial support, among others. It might be through an illustrative, if not comprehensive list, and this has been highlighted by other delegations in the morning as well. We welcome the reference to post-conflict recovery instead of post-conflict stabilization, which as a concept implies creating the political conditions to ensure the continuity of the cessation of hostilities between parties to an armed conflict, an aspect which in our view does not belong to the scope of the political declaration. We would nevertheless like to see clarification as to what is meant by durable solutions. As currently drafted, this terminology is quite vague, and as a concept could be more related to, again, creating political conditions to ensure the continuity of cessation of hostilities between parties to an armed conflict. 4.6, we believe this is a core paragraph. Defining an effective follow-up process speaks to the legitimacy of the commitments we've undertaken and overall the legitimacy of the political declaration. We strongly believe that any follow-up process should be conducted in an open, transparent, and inclusive manner, involving relevant stakeholders other than states. The unacceptable pattern of harm shows the magnitude of the challenge in implementing the core principles of IHL in protecting civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. In this regard, translating IHL into action requires a multidimensional approach with an inclusive participation, military, humanitarian, legal, diplomatic, etc., to share experiences and views which go beyond the military perspective. In our view, and taken into account what we have heard this morning, the best option would be the approach adopted by the Safe Schools Declaration. Along these lines, we propose the following: meet on a regular basis, inviting relevant international organizations and civil society, so as to review the operationalization of its core commitments in accordance with the principles of non-politicization and non-contextualization, with the aim to strengthen the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of a WIPA. In our view, the proposed Good Practices Working Group should not be a starting point for the regular meetings to review the operationalization of the declaration. Rather, it would be a separate and distinct body if it is decided to be useful by the review process. Regarding some of the new proposals that we heard today, we can support Switzerland's text proposals on the importance of establishing of the facts and ensuring accountability. We can also support the ICRC's text proposal on the need to include in paragraph 4.1 a reference to partnered military operations and the situation where support is provided to a party to armed conflicts. The lack of inclusion of this common situation might create a gap in the implementation of the political declaration. Last but not least, Chairperson, we understand the need to be realistic and the need to be grounded in practicality. We would respond to this that it is the reality in the ground that shows that the majority of victims of the use of a WIPA, in particular with wide area effects, are civilians. The commitments and measures that we are advocating in this declaration are precisely aimed at having an impact in the real world in ways that we effectively revert the humanitarian consequences from the use of EWIPA. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much. And now I call the next on our list, which is the Holy See, to be followed by New Zealand. So Holy See, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. We do not have specific problems with Section 4. On the contrary, we support and appreciate your efforts. We deem this section to be very important as it brings back the focus of the declaration on the victims. As we said yesterday, the tragic reality of victims and what can be done to strengthen their protection should be the guiding principle and added value of this declaration. In this regard, we have three slight specific suggestions that we would like to share. First, in paragraph 4.2, besides acknowledging the impact on civilians, we deem it very important to also make a specific reference to the impact of armed conflict on critical civilian infrastructure, schools, hospitals, as well as places of worship. It is important, in our view, to broaden the scope of this paragraph to also address the critical infrastructure on which civilians depend on for their integral human development. Second, the Holy See extremely values and supports the participation of civil society, and we are glad to see that several of them are actively engaged in this process. Among them, we would also like to see a specific reference in the text to faith-based organizations, which often are among the ones which operate in conflict areas. Third, the proposal made in paragraph 4.4, I think it was by France this morning, to add a reference to taking into account the needs of affected populations, seems, in our view, to better capture the needs-based approach that, in our view, should guide the response and the purpose of data collection. Data collection has to serve a specific purpose, in our view, is to respond to the needs of victims. Moreover, as suggested by several other delegations, including lastly by Chile and Mexico, a more specific outline of what assistance and support entails could be beneficial. We will be submitting specific language in writing as well. Lastly, on paragraph 4.6, we've heard the concerns of some delegation on the follow-up process, and some of them appear to be reasonable to us. We believe that such process is, however, important, and perhaps a reformulation of the proposed terms of reference and a better clarity on the purpose could better capture the importance of reviewing the status of implementation of the declaration. Also keeping in mind that situations change and evolve over time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor now to New Zealand.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to our fellow delegations in the Chamber who have so thoughtfully contributed their inputs to Section 4 today. From our vantage point, there appears to be convergence developing in this Chamber. We all want to adopt a high-quality declaration which has meaningful impact on the lives of civilians in conflict zones. We all appreciate that achieving a critical mass of states is critical to giving effect to the aims of this declaration in years to come. In that regard, there seems to be a general acknowledgement that implementation of the declaration in the years to come, including its ongoing promotion and uptake, will require further effort. Now, we are at the point where we are debating the shape of that process. We should recognise the progress that we have made thus far, even if we have not yet completed our journey entirely. A meaningful implementation mechanism is crucial to our endeavour, in Aotearoa New Zealand's view. With it, we will go from increasing awareness and political buy-in of governments to restrict or refrain from use of explosive weapons with wide area effects, to the hard business of using it to reinforce or, where needed, encourage the reshaping of practices relevant to the use of explosive weapons. At the end of the day, we all want this to yield results that translate into protection for victims of armed conflict from explosive weapons use. So, when asking ourselves whether we need an ongoing implementation mechanism of the sort suggested in paragraph 4.6, it is New Zealand's view that yes, we do. We have appreciated the opportunity this meeting has provided to hear of the experiences of colleagues in this room, including military perspectives and the steps they have taken to mitigate civilian harm. We welcome and encourage these developments, including the humanitarian objectives at their core. Military dialogue will, of course, play an important role in whatever implementation process is agreed, and we have considerable experience, including in the Convention on Cluster Munitions and the Anti-Personnel and Mine Ban Convention, that we can learn from. But we would also argue that this process needs an ongoing diplomatic process to ensure the momentum we have been building lasts beyond the ceremony adopting this political declaration. Such a process would continue to shine a spotlight on an issue that is unlikely to disappear with the promulgation of our declaration, and it would provide a certain convening power. We would like to speak to the issue of politicization, which has been raised by several delegations this morning. This is not a characterization that we would necessarily share. We are engaged in an inherently political process of collective choice-making. That is what politics and, as an extension, diplomacy are. We are negotiating a political declaration. There may be a good argument for why, upon adoption, the following implementation processes become ultimately a technical exercise, but we haven't had that impressed upon us by the discussion this morning. In our view, it would be quite possible to pitch any future dialogue and process at an appropriate level, one recognizing the nature of the document as a set of political commitments instead of a treaty-based mechanism. Indeed, we have experience of this in other forums. We do, however, sympathise with the concerns raised, for example, by the Netherlands, on avoiding duplication across work streams and operational questions raised around format, hosts, and costs. We see there are two options for how this is characterised in the text. Either we go into elaborate detail on this process, or we opt for a high-level commitment that we trust ourselves to put into action. I think New Zealand would prefer the latter, and on this basis, we would prefer the final sentence of paragraph 4.6 is deleted. This sentence, which begins with "as a starting point," strikes us as an unnecessarily specific sentence. In our view, we must pitch the language in the declaration at a high level without being overly prescriptive. The open nature of this process would rightly mirror the open and transparent process that Ireland has led us through these last few years, and enhanced by the inclusive and high-quality participation of the ICRC, UN agencies, and civil society. It is our hope and expectation that this continues in any future configuration. Ultimately, it is up to all of us in this room to identify points of convergence, but it is our sense that we all have an interest in ensuring our efforts have an enduring effect beyond the adoption of our declaration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one more speaker on the list at the moment, Matt for Peace, and I give you the floor now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to talk now, since we could not participate earlier. At the outset, we would like to thank the efforts made by Ireland to coordinate these meetings, as well as the draft political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Because civilians, as the most harmed group of armed conflicts, they are the ones who pay its price. MAT Association, and its capacity as the technical secretary of the Global Coalition for Limitation of Armaments, a coalition of civil society organizations from Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, would like to present to you some recommendations. Our organization works in international humanitarian law, and arms control, whether in research, advocacy, or peace and security promotion. Today, we participate in these discussions to call for a strong political declaration, because to this day, the international humanitarian law is clearly and openly violated, and every state involved in conflict over the past decade claimed to be in full compliance with the IHL. Simply reaffirming international humanitarian law is not enough to bring meaningful change. We take this opportunity and present to you some proposals that could help strengthening that draft. We urge states to ensure that the declaration properly addresses the environmental risks arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And we would like to point out the need to properly integrate measures to protect the environment when dealing with its legacy. Research conducted by MAT Association and the Global Coalition for Limitation of Armaments has highlighted the serious environmental risks associated with the use of explosive weapons, especially when residential areas are mixed with industrial, commercial, and energy infrastructure. Protecting the environment and the services it provides is a vital component of protecting civilians. Environmental pollution associated with the use of explosive weapons poses acute and chronic health risks to civilians. The use of explosive weapons is a particular environmental concern due to the destruction or damages to infrastructure and other objects in populated areas. Therefore, we ask countries to consider replacing the term natural environment with the term environment. Also, the term natural environment is used in additional Protocol 1. It is considered an artifact of its period of development and does not reflect a contemporary understanding of the relationship between people and the environment, nor of the value of the environment as such. We also call for a reference to illegal arms transfers to countries affected by armed conflicts and the need to include the phrase compliance with the Arms Trade Treaty in arms transfers. Knowing that the primary purpose of the project is to protect civilians, it is necessary to highlight the illegal transfer of arms to countries affected by armed conflict. In conclusion, we appreciate the item on strengthening cooperation, especially cooperation with civil society organizations, and with any organization to promote national humanitarian law, protect civilians in armed conflict. We hope that there will be a greater opportunity for civil society organizations in the Arab region to participate in these meetings, as a greater number of organizations will enhance the effectiveness of achieving common goals. We also want to emphasize the importance of the participation of youth in promoting our document. We in MAT have realized through our work the importance of the role of youth in promoting and implementing international humanitarian law, as we have trained more than 100 young men and women in areas affected by armed conflict. Helping the youth understand IHL will help strengthening the principle of protection of civilians in armed conflict. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Well, we have no more speakers on the list, so I just want to... Oh, yes, I see Austria. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Very briefly, Austria already spoke on Section 4, but we wanted to come in with one more additional comment. And just, if you allow me to say, in general, we very much appreciate the interactivity of our conversations here, chaired by you, and the possibility to always come back in and reflect on certain proposals made by other delegations. In our reading, this will be very beneficial for the final outcome of our discussions. Just on 4.6, and in reaction to some claims that the language of that paragraph might not be an appropriate wording for a political declaration, we just wanted to state that references to implementations are not uncommon in political declarations, and the Safe Schools Declaration was already cited in this respect. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, I do. If anyone has any comments on what they've heard, this is a good moment to make them. And Norway would like to intervene. So Norway, you have the floor.
Thank you. We've also listened to the various interventions on paragraph 4.6 with interest, and it seems that Chile, Mexico, and Austria have looked in my papers. This is one of the core paragraphs of the text, since it underscores, of course, that this is, as many have said, not the end point of the process, rather the beginning. And in line with that, we believe that Article 4.6 does not have to be overly prescriptive. It's not a treaty, it's a declaration, and the fundamental value lies in the strong political commitment that the endorsees demonstrate. A prescriptive list of what, when, who, etc. is not needed to ensure that we follow up, as long as we just commit to actually meeting. And we also have to trust that future international meetings are capable of fleshing out what needs to be done. For reference, we can look at the Safe Schools Declaration, as others have mentioned just now, which has had 4 successful international conferences based on the very simple undertaking to, I quote, meet on a regular basis, inviting relevant international organizations and civil society organizations, so as to review the implementation of this declaration and the use of the guidelines. And I'd also like to note as well that the word implementation has been used here without any problems. And to our knowledge, nobody has interpreted that word in that context to mean that the Safe Schools Declaration imposes legal obligations. Also, in regard to the issue of politicized meetings, we'd like to just point out that the Safe Schools conferences have not devolved into such. WIPA is, of course, different, but also similar, with protection of civilians at its core. And we assume that meetings under WIPA will be informed by the same positive spirit to achieve practical progress that we've seen in the Safe Schools Declaration. Finally, on 4.6, we think that it can be shortened considerably. The last sentence on the development of a compilation is an issue that we think is better left to the future follow-up process. And the final point regarding the concept of reverberating effects, we too have reservations about this. We find the reference to reverberating effects relevant in Chapter 1, which gives us an entry point for future elaboration of the concept, but wish to replace it with indirect effects in Chapter 3 and 4. We know that the term has been debated for quite some time, but still we don't find it particularly intuitive from an operational perspective. And the important point is that the political declaration recognized the wide range of harmful indirect effects of the WIPA, which Chapter 1 currently does very well, not what label we put on this, and especially not if it's a polarizing label. And in light of the way the indirect effects have been elaborated in Chapter 1, we don't think there is a need for reverberating effects in Chapter 3 and 4. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other delegations who would like? Oh, yes. United States, you have the floor.
Chairman, just to touch on reaction on 2 points. The first is to comment on a suggestion made by Switzerland, and that was seconded by Mexico and Chile, and that's that we should be adding language to address allegations of violations of IHL and accountability. We feel strongly that the follow-up mechanism to this declaration is not the place to do that. I think, as everyone knows, in the context of the current fighting in Ukraine, there are a number of areas, a number of organizations, a number of initiatives taken to address those very types of issues. And we don't think that we should create something out of this declaration that would also work in that area. The second point, Mr. Chairman, is to comment on the references. I think there's been 2, 3, maybe even 4 references to the Safe Schools Declaration as a positive template. Just to note, Mr. Chairman, that one of our main goals with this declaration is to get militarily active states not only to join the declaration, but also to participate fully in the follow-up mechanisms. And I think one of the unfortunate things about the Safe Schools Declaration, and I know there's a lot of positive things related to it, and possibly some things we can learn in their follow-up mechanism. There are some major militarily active states that have not embraced the Safe Schools Declaration and do not participate. And my government, for example, does not. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm just looking around the room for any more interventions on section 4. I don't see any, so I think we can conclude that. And thank you very much for those interventions. Thank you for the detail you've gone into, and the spirit of the discussion, which I hope we can now bring to the next section. So we'll go back to the opening the chapeau of Part B and Section 3. And this the overall operative part of the text is setting out the high-level political commitments in the declaration. And the chapeau is intended to establish a clear and active sense of intention, framed by the verb we will. And it describes the purpose of the commitments undertaken as being intended to strengthen compliance with IHL and the protection of civilians, and to address the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. So the revised version of the Chapeau also now broadens the scope to more accurately reflect that we are committed to strengthening the protection of civilians during and after armed conflict. On the substantive part of section 3, paragraphs 3.1 and 3.2 have very few changes on the last draft. These parts call for states to review, implement, and where necessary, develop or improve national policies and practices with regard to the protection of civilians in armed conflict. The existing language and comprehensive training for armed forces and international humanitarian law remains unchanged. And that brings us then to section 3.3. And it is obviously one of the paragraphs on which we have received and are receiving the most comments during the written and the virtual consultations, and again yesterday and even today. For many delegations, this paragraph involves one of the key commitments in the political declaration. So I think it's worth reflecting on it just a little bit before we open up the discussion, we open up the floor. As it's currently formulated in this draft, paragraph 3.3 calls for the adoption and implementation of a range of policies and practices to avoid civilian harm, including by restricting or refraining from the use of explosive weapons when the effects may be expected to extend beyond a military objective. And it also adds that this commitment should be done fully in accordance with international humanitarian law. Now, this paragraph generates the most discussion, and I think we should be very clear that it is very important to read it in association with the chapeau of this section, as it is not the intention of this paragraph, as we keep stating, but I think it's important to restate it. It's not the intention of this paragraph to create a new legal standard, but to reinforce our shared commitment to implementing in full our obligations under international humanitarian law and our shared goal of improving the protection of civilians during armed conflict. And while the interpretations may vary on how best to do this, I think it's important to send a strong political signal that we, the international community, are determined to address the humanitarian issues that arise from the use of EWIPA. So the revised paragraph 3.3 maintains the original language to, quote, avoid civilian harm, but it adds the words or refrain after restrict to the range of policies and practices to achieve this. And this language, we've included this language in order to capture the views that were expressed by a number of delegations that a one-size-fits-all would not be appropriate to adequately address this issue. And we are very keen to hear your views on this and on the other edits that have been made, and also we'd be very keen to hear possible proposals to bridge the gap in positions. Then paragraph 3.4 covers the planning of attacks and the need for armed forces to ensure that they take into account the direct and reverberating effects on civilians and civilian objects. The paragraph now includes additional language on conducting battle damage assessments to the degree feasible to identify lessons learned. Paragraphs 3.5 and 3.6 remain unchanged. They include references to the marking, clearance, and removal or destruction of ERW in accordance with relevant obligations under applicable international law. 3.6 includes a reference to non-state armed groups and reinforces one of the central messages of this text, that all parties to armed conflict must respect and implement international humanitarian law. So with that introduction to this section, which I know you have all studied in great detail, I'm going to open up the floor for comments and proposals on this section of the text. So when I say comments and proposals, it will be very helpful if you have any ideas on how to bridge the gaps that we have identified, but also we want to hear your clear positions also. So I'm going to open the floor, and the first speaker on the list is Turkey. Turkey, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. The entrance paragraph of Part B operative section should start with strive, and this paragraph should end with bearing in mind the 13th Conventional Weapons Convention and recalling amended Article 1, paragraph 4 and 5 of the Convention. We will, as appropriate. Why would we like to see such a reference? Because this declaration should not be invoked for the purpose of affecting the sovereignty of a state and used as a justification for intervening directly or indirectly. As we highlighted in the first section of the draft, it would be appropriate to include the qualifier indiscriminate before the use of EVIPA. We think that it will be appropriate to use the term seek, endeavor, or pursue in order to ensure regarding the efforts to be made in accordance with the purpose of the political declaration in 3.2, 3.3, 3.4, and 3.5. And we propose 3.3 as follows: endeavor that our armed forces adopt and implement a range of policies and practices for the use of explosive weapons in populated areas to avoid civilian harm to the greatest extent possible, in accordance with commitments under international humanitarian law. It would be appropriate to use indirect effects instead of the reverberating effects, again in 3.4. In 3.6, the term all parties to an armed conflict would suffice. We would like to see the deletion of including by non-state armed groups. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor next to Chile and Mexico.
Ambassador, we weren't expecting so quickly. Sorry, let me just come back to. Okay, thanks so much. Firstly, with regard to the chapeau, we appreciate the inclusion of several changes in the drafting of the chapeau, which now allows us to establish a direct linkage between the characterization of the problem in the preambular section of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas and the clear and concrete political measures and commitments we are undertaking to tackle the problem. In particular, we acknowledge the relevance of protection of civilians during and after armed conflict that broadens the scope of protection, which is the goal we are expecting from this political declaration. However, we would like to propose a modification to the current text to be in line with the purpose of the declaration, which is to address the humanitarian consequences of the use of explosive weapons, particularly those with wide area effects. Therefore, we would propose the last sentence to say, and addressing the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons, particularly those with wide area effects in populated areas during armed conflict. Now on section 3 and specific 3.1, it is important to frame this commitment in line with the purpose and objective of the political declaration, which is centered on the protection of civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, not with regard to armed conflict in general. Therefore, we would like to propose the following: review, implement, and where necessary, develop or improve national policies and practices with regard to the protection of civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas during and after armed conflict. The comments with regard to during and after armed conflict and to the use of explosive weapons in populated areas that we propose for these paragraphs should be streamlined throughout the section. 3.2. As has also been previously expressed by the ICRC, The commitment in this paragraph should not just be on training on policies and practices to strengthen the protection of civilians, which undoubtedly is important, but it is equally important that armed forces should be given the means to conduct hostilities in populated areas in a manner that will minimize the unacceptable risk of civilian harm. It is not enough to train the combatants on humanitarian policies and practices if the only means available to them make it impossible to fulfill such policies and practices. It does not imply either that any attack is limited to the use of sophisticated or state-of-the-art weaponry, but that the existing and available means should be analyzed under the prism of which types of operations could be carried out under a humanitarian approach. 3.3. This is a fundamental paragraph of the declaration, as you have stated, and I'm sure all of us will make, as it refers to the core objective. While we can see some improvement from the previous version, we still consider it needs to be streamlined. In our view, as identified by the UN Secretary General and the President of the ICRC, this paragraph should include an actual commitment for the avoidance of use of explosive weapons of wide area effects in populated areas. This clear commitment would be a fundamental message to the international community on how to strengthen compliance with IHL during the conduct of hostilities, and would be the commitment that fundamentally and concretely addresses the humanitarian consequences caused by explosive weapons, particularly those with wide area effects in populated areas. The avoidance policy does not imply a prohibition or aims de facto to stigmatize explosive weapons or intends to create new legal obligations. It is not a prohibition. IHL does not prohibit explosive weapons, as we saw it and expressed it also in the morning. IHL aims at protecting civilians against the unacceptable risk of harm that they are exposed to during the performance of military operations. The implementation of IHL is a balancing act between military necessity and humanitarian considerations. As the ICRC, OCHA, and civil society organizations have stated, the rule of distinction prohibits indiscriminate attacks, which comprises weapons that can't be directed against a specific military objective because they have a large margin of error. Factual evidence shows that when explosive weapons with wide area effects are used in populated areas, it is very difficult to comply with the rule of indiscriminate attacks. At the same time, when assessing the proportionality of an attack and calculating the military advantage, the uncertainty lies whether military commanders actually take into account not only the direct effects, but also the indirect and or reverberating effects. This is uncertain, and judging from the results, it remains to be clarified, as well as compliance with key IHL rules. With the choice of explosive weapons in a populated area, particularly the ones with wide area effects, are we taking all feasible precautions to avoid or minimize the unacceptable risk of civilian harm? Should other weapons be used instead? Or use of explosive weapons but modifying the technical parameters in order to limit the wide area effects, thus reducing the unacceptable risk of civilian harm? These are all legal considerations of existing IHL rules. There are no new legal obligations being spelled out or even hinted to, just clarity for compliance with the existing legal framework. The strengthening would entail clarity on the interpretation of key IHL principles by states and how they apply them with regards to explosive weapons, and particularly the ones with wide area effects. Given the grave pattern of harm to civilians, it is not enough to simply declare respect for IHL. The avoidance policy, again, not a prohibition and not a new legal obligation, entails taking measures to ensure the respect of IHL and to limit the risk to civilians by limiting the wide area effects, by using alternative weapons when fighting in populated areas in order to protect civilians. This practice or policy of avoidance should be taken from the strategic, operational, and tactical levels, complemented with the necessary training and equipment for armed forces to be able to operate in full compliance with IHL. Last but not least, regarding the argument made about the stigmatization of explosive weapons, in particular the ones with wide area effect, we believe that the process of stigmatization is a practical consequence of the indiscriminate effects of a weapon and not attributable to a political declaration. In our views, this declaration aims at highlighting a humanitarian problem and the policy commitments states are willing to undertake to strengthen compliance with IHL. On the specific drafting of this paragraph, we consider that it should streamline the core commitments with regard to the use of explosive weapons. We would therefore suggest the following drafting. Ensure that our armed forces adopt and implement specific policies and practices to prevent civilian harm, including by avoiding the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas, unless sufficient mitigation measures can be taken to minimize the risk of indiscriminate effects. Reverting back to the current drafting, we would certainly insist on implement specific policies to avoid civilian harm by refraining from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas when the effects should be anticipated to extend beyond the military objective. Taking into account the fact based on evidence and studies conducted, we propose to substitute the phrase may be expected to should be anticipated. Finally, we would support those who have questioned the inclusion of the last phrase in accordance with IHL. Its inclusion, as has been expressed by the ICRC on their comments, can generate confusion, ambiguity, and uncertainty as regards the scope of the commitment and its relationship to existing legal obligations. Regarding paragraph 3.4, we commend you for the explicit inclusion of indirect effects as elements to be considered and reasonably foreseen in planning military operations and the execution of attacks. We are of the view, however, that this paragraph can be further streamlined as follows. Ensure that our armed forces take into account the direct and indirect effects on civilians and civilian objects, which can be reasonably foreseen in the planning of military operations and execution of attacks in populated areas, as to ensure that the balance between military necessity and humanitarian considerations is adequately met. Battle damage assessments, we have already mentioned it in the part of, in the comments on part 4. 3.5, this paragraph is referring to obligations for state parties to CCW Protocol 5. In order to distinguish between legal and policy commitments, we would suggest deleting the reference to in accordance with our obligations under applicable international law. 3.6, in our understanding, the dissemination and understanding of IHL and the promotion of its respect and implementation is a legal obligation, hence it should be included in section 2 and not as an operative commitment. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. The next speakers on the list are Human Rights Watch, followed by Spain. So Human Rights Watch, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I am making the statement on behalf of the International Network on Explosive Weapons, INEW. The impact and success of the political declaration will depend on the strength of Section 3, and in particular, paragraph 3.3. Paragraph 3.3 is the core commitment in this declaration, and it must be bold and carefully crafted. This commitment can maximize the power of the declaration to protect civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. There are two main changes that need to be made to 3.3. First, the phrase explosive weapons with wide area effects should be reinserted. As noted yesterday, this should be accompanied by language in Section 1 of the preamble that when used in populated areas, explosive weapons with wide area effects inevitably and significantly increase the risk of harm to civilians and damage to civilian objects, given their concentration in populated areas. The preamble text should also describe factors that produce these wide area effects: a wide blast and fragmentation radius, inaccuracy of delivery, the firing of multiple warheads across an area, or some combination of these factors. The second key change to paragraph 3.3 is to replace restricting or refraining with avoiding. A commitment to avoid use of explosive weapons when they have wide area effects in populated areas would provide clarity and boldness to the core commitment in the declaration, and in doing so, help to ensure the strongest protection to civilians. This would reflect recommendations from the UN Secretary General, the ICRC, and other field-based humanitarian organizations, as well as many states. A change of mindset is urgently needed. And a commitment to avoid use encompasses an approach of needing to undertake prior assessments and changes to policies to establish a presumption against use. This commitment could be further strengthened by suggesting specific assessments that would facilitate and promote a clear understanding and implementation of this commitment, including undertaking prior assessment of the area effects of specific types of explosive weapons and assessments of the specific context of use and of the urban environment. Moreover, the reference to "in accordance with international humanitarian law" should simply be removed, as the paragraph is a policy commitment under this declaration. The commitment should also be higher up in the operative section, given its centrality to the declaration and the fact that other commitments, such as training, stem from this. In addition to 3.3, a new paragraph, 3.4 bis, would be vital. While the political declaration recognizes the importance of tracking civilian harm in military operations in the preamble, it does not provide a corresponding commitment to do so in section 3. New text should be inserted, 3.4 bis. Tracking civilian harm in real time means tracking the number and rate of civilian casualties to inform how many civilians are being killed and injured, as well as tracking damage to civilian objects. It would also involve assessing whether the situation is improving or getting worse, which can help to shape both operational and policy responses to better protect civilians. When matched with commitments to be transparent over data sharing and to investigate credible allegations of civilian harm, it can help to provide better protection to civilians and promote compliance with international law. Battle damage assessments and collateral damage estimation methodologies are useful military tools, but are not designed as tools to assess humanitarian impacts and have some fundamental limitations. We have brief comments and suggestions for the other paragraphs in section 3. In 3.1, this commitment could be more prescriptive in driving specific actions that would be most effective in protecting civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas by adding the phrase, "in particular from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas." Also replacing the phrase "with regard to" with the phrase "to enhance" would clarify and strengthen the commitments. This commitment should reference measures and good practices not only during, but also after conflict. With respect to 3.2, this commitment should ensure training on the declaration itself rather than international humanitarian law, which is already a legal requirement. The training should be focused on the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And as before, it should be applied both during and after armed conflict. 3.4, we welcome this commitment that focuses on addressing the reverberating effects of explosive weapon use, which are considerable. The commitment could be strengthened further by clearly stating that armed forces should specifically assess and take steps to mitigate the different foreseeable effects rather than simply taking them into account. Finally, it should delete the clause regarding BDA, battle damage assessments, which already noted focus on the military effectiveness rather than the civilian impact of military operations or armed conflict. 3.5, this commitment should include references to risk education, which are currently missing in the text. References to risk education, and should replace explosive remnants of war with explosive ordnance, which is a broader term. And then lastly, on 3.6, this commitment should focus on dissemination and understandings of the operative commitments of this political declaration, rather than disseminating IHL, which is already a legal obligation. INEW's detailed comments and specific language suggestions have already been submitted in writing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to Spain, to be followed by France. Spain, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think we're having a very interesting dialogue that is bringing us closer to joint positions, and little by little, we will strike the necessary balance in our proposals. I'm going to refer to some general aspects of Section 3, and in particular 3.3, which, as has already been said, is the most complex one. Spain already made a contribution of language, and most of that was accepted, particularly in 3.1, to call attention to countries that already have national policies and programs that include these standards. We can say that we defend some of the positions in the written contribution from the International Committee for the Red Cross at the end of 3.2 in particular. We think that the ICRC's proposal improves the text. As for the controversial 3.3, it is the most difficult one of all. Our written proposal involved a merging of 3.3 and 3.4, but we see that it has not garnered consensus, and we're not going to continue drafting our own language on this, and rather wait for inputs and contributions from other delegations to then be able to support them. To focus on what we think is difficult and complex is the term when the effects may be expected to extend beyond a military objective. This phrase being inserted, may be expected, are concepts that introduce a certain conditionality and variability, which is very difficult to deal with if we are in a process of allocating responsibility on the part of a military command or in a military operation. This is our main difficulty, and therefore we have a constructive attitude towards any proposal that may come in to support this process and to reach a result that is satisfactory to all. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor now to France, to be followed by the ICRC. France, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you also for Section 3 as slightly reformulated, which also seems to be moving in the right direction. We are fully aware of the difficulties in the section. It's really the heart of the subject because this is a section which involves firm commitments on how one can reduce human suffering. The heading is satisfactory. We will needs to be kept. We're happy with that because it's a firm commitment that we're going to enter into. As to the rest of the section, I have no difficulties with the 3.2, 3.5, and 3.6, 3 paragraphs where we think that everything is acceptable and that they can be endorsed as such. Now, as to the other paragraphs, 3.1 is an important paragraph. We support it. And it highlights the need for states to implement operational practices relating to the protection of civilians and civilian objects. And as the text has pointed out, many states have already adopted these practices. So it does seem to us that the term review ought to come after where necessary to reflect this idea that some states already have practices and policies on that subject. Now, as to 3.3, we are well aware that this is the heart of our declaration, without, of course, neglecting other parts of the text, but this is a very important part of the text. Now, if we want a declaration that will really allow for improved protection of civilians and civilian objects, we need a wording that reflects the obligations of states under IHL, and also, and I'd stress this, that would contribute to practice in the field. Our aim should be that states must take specific measures to enhance protection of civilians, adapting methods of war to use force in a proper way, and particularly limiting explosive weapons in areas where civilians are largely present. So for that purpose, armed forces need to take the appropriate measures to avoid such damage and losses and abide by the fundamental principles of IHL. These measures could, in certain circumstances, lead to restricting or abstaining from the use of weapons, as pointed out in para 3.3. But I would like to stress another point, which is that these are decisions to be taken on the basis of an evaluation of the effects of a strike in light of specific direct military advantages as expected. And my delegation also believes that this is an appropriate paragraph, but that we need to delete the clause when the effects may be expected to extend beyond a military objective. Because if we keep that in the paragraph, that we wouldn't be striking the balance between military needs and humanitarian concerns. So that's on 3.3. On 3.4, and this is my final comment on this section, we believe it important to have battle damage assessments as proposed, as well as to identify lessons learned, provided that these processes don't always occur during the same time. So given the importance of these two dimensions in practical terms, we'd like to add an and before identify lessons learned, and to identify, and before to identify lessons learned. I'm sorry I took maybe a bit long in my statement, but I will be submitting these minor proposals to you in writing. Thank you very much.
Merci. And I give the floor next to the ICRC, who to be followed by Ecuador. ICRC, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As one distinguished delegate mentioned earlier this afternoon at the end of the discussion on Section 4, the fundamental value of the declarations holds in the commitment taken through it. In this respect, we welcome the number of concrete commitments in this Section 2 to enhance the protection of civilians when armed conflict takes place in populated area. However, we are concerned that a clear commitment to avoid the use of those explosive weapons that raise the most concern in populated area is still missing from the revised draft. We have made a number of detailed proposals on these sections in our written submission, which I will not repeat here. Instead, I will like to focus on paragraph 3.3 and 3.6. On paragraph 3.3, I couldn't have said it better than the previous speaker. So, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, si vous me permettez de vous citer.
Well, without wishing to minimize other commitments in the declaration, para 3.3, and we agree with France on this, is really at the heart of this declaration.
ICRC continues to hold the view that if the protection of civilians is to be effectively strengthened, states should adopt policies and practices to avoid using explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated area. We have suggested that such a commitment would entail not to use explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated area, unless sufficient mitigation measures have been taken to reduce the weapon's area effect and the consequent risk of civilian harm. In a milestone report published earlier this year, we elaborated on how such a commitment could be implemented, submitting dozens of concrete and practical recommendations for political and military authorities. So with regard to the latest draft, we welcome that the text has been strengthened by including a reference to refraining from the use of explosive weapons in populated area when the effects may be expected to extend beyond the military objective. However, the text now is written as an alternative to restrict or refrain, leaving open the options to merely restricting the use of explosive weapons. In our view, this falls short of the actions required to strengthen the protection of civilians, which is the aim of this declaration. As you know, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the broader Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, and the Secretary General of the United Nations have been calling on states and all parties to armed conflicts, which includes non-state armed groups, to avoid the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated area. Several dozens of states has already made similar commitments. Whichever formulation is chosen, a commitment to avoid the use of those explosive weapons of most concerns in populated area should, in the ICRC view, be at the core of the declaration. The phrase, when the effects may be expected to extend beyond the military objective, focuses the commitment on precisely those explosive weapons that are of most concern because of their wide area effect. We strongly welcome this focus and urge you to retain it. The addition of the qualifier in accordance with IHL, however, raised a number of issues, which we explained in detail in our written submission. First, it risks creating confusions between existing legal obligations, which in the ICRC view should be addressed in Section 2, and the new policy commitment. Secondly, it creates ambiguity and uncertainty around the scope of the commitment, as it can be read in different ways. If it is read as limiting the scope of the commitment to restricting or refraining from the use of explosive weapons only in case where IHL would so require, this would reduce the scope of the commitment to the implementation of existing legal obligation. Such a commitment would significantly reduce the added value of the political declaration and constitute an underwhelming outcome for a several-year-long multilateral process. Furthermore, it would actually risk undermining existing legal obligation by reiterating them in the form of a policy commitment. The ICRC strongly advises against taking such an approach. The same holds true of various proposals to rephrase this paragraph using language reflecting or paraphrasing the IHL prohibition of indiscriminate or disproportionate attack or the obligation to take all feasible precautions in attack. In light of all of this, we recommend replacing the words restricting or refraining from, with one single verb, avoiding. And we also recommend deleting in accordance with international humanitarian law. On paragraph 3.6, and I will be much shorter, we recommend added and the commitments undertaken in this declaration just after the reference to international humanitarian law. In the view of the ICRC, it is important that states commit to promoting the commitment undertaken by means of these declarations towards both states and non-state parties to armed conflicts, and the same holds true with the implementation of those commitments. This is key to effectively strengthening the protection of civilians against the deleterious effects of explosive weapons used in populated area, irrespective of the users. In this regard, our proposal is in line with the proposal made by Germany earlier on paragraph 4.7, which we also support as a suitable alternative. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to Ecuador, to be followed by the Philippines. Ecuador, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, Chair. Concerning Section 3, we are grateful for all the efforts that you've made, and we will restrict our comments to what we consider to be most important. So in the introductory part, given the crucial importance of this section, we would like to insist on the appropriateness of stressing the great worry and concern about the use of these weapons in populated areas, which is one of the main thrusts of the political declaration. We would repeat our proposal to start the introductory sentence by something like deeply concerned over the devastating effects and the unacceptable levels of suffering among civilians and the harm caused by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and therefore committed to strengthening the protection, to taking urgent measures to strengthen the protection and continue as is. Now, concerning 3.3, the central part of the declaration, it is very difficult for us to accept a commitment that is not sufficiently important to bring about a change in the current situation concerning the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Therefore, we would insist that we should not use the word restrict and simply use the word avoid. In any case, limiting the commitment on the use of explosive weapons in the broad sense of the word, which is what we want to avoid, means that we must strengthen the commitment so we can accept the additional phraseology in this paragraph. In that context, we agree with the delegations who have said that it is necessary to keep the language at the end of the paragraph in accordance with international humanitarian law. Additionally, avoiding the use of these weapons must be the main recommendation in the declaration, and therefore, after the word including, we should also have a word like necessarily or always, to make it clear that these are different alternatives. In 3.4, it is necessary for the armed forces to take a more active role. Therefore, we should replace the word take into account by evaluate. And in 3.5, we should note, in addition to international humanitarian law, the importance of disseminating the objectives of this political declaration. Thank you very much.
Next on the list is Philippines, to be followed by Wilf. Philippines, you have the floor.
Mr. Chair, the Philippines thanks Ireland for its leadership in putting together this draft. We appreciate the efforts to bring together divergent views on how best to strike a balance in our commitment to implement IHL, protect civilians, and ensure full humanitarian access in the context of EWIPA use. We see Section 3.3 as an important commitment that requires vetting by our relevant stakeholders, and we reserve our right to provide further comment on this provision once we complete our internal consultation process. We welcome the formulation of the chapeau of this section. We affirm our view that the focus of this section must be on our commitment to strengthen the protection of civilians and civilian objects during and after armed conflict, compliance with IHL, and addressing humanitarian consequences. The focus is not to create new norms or obligations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Wilf, and they will be followed by Switzerland. Wilf, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. WILP supports the comments, of course, by INU, and as an organization, we just have a few points that we want to raise or amplify. 3.3, as many others have stated, is the core commitment of this declaration and must set the strongest possible standard. It should be moved up in the declaration as other commitments flow from it. The goal should be to end the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. This could be enacted through a commitment to not use a WIPA. While WILP welcomes the commitment related to addressing reverberating effects of the use of a WIPA in 3.4, this paragraph does seem to assume that attacks in populated areas are legitimate and will continue. This paragraph could be better qualified to avoid that presumption, for example, by saying, assess and take steps to prevent direct, indirect, and reverberating effects on civilians and civilian objects, including by not using a WIPA, avoiding military operations in populated areas, and not treating civilian objects as military objectives. To build on existing practice and to reflect the points about data collection in Section 1, there should be a commitment in perhaps a 3.4 bis that establishes capabilities to track, analyze, respond to, and learn from incidents of civilian harm, including damage to civilian objects. 3.5 should include references to risk education and risk reduction in the context of explosive ordnance, and environmental remediation could also be added to this paragraph. I'd also like to make a general comment in response to those who continue to call for the declaration to narrow the scope to indiscriminate use or illegal use of a WIPA. This would undermine the humanitarian value of the declaration, making it only a political affirmation of states' obligations to follow the law. But we see every day that some states claim that their actions are in accordance with the law, or that the weapons that they have sold into conflict are being used in accordance with the law, even while the devastating results are clear to all. If 90% of casualties from the use of a WIPA are civilians, even as militaries claim that their actions are lawful, then there is a serious problem. It means that states, whether they believe themselves to be in compliance with IHL or not, are still killing and injuring civilians and creating lasting damage and destruction by bombing towns, cities, and villages. It means that regardless of the alleged lawfulness of an attack, unconscionable harm is still resulting. If we are serious about protecting civilians, we cannot focus on intentionally indiscriminate attacks. We have to address all use of a WIPA. We cannot sufficiently protect civilians just by calling on states to comply with the law. As other delegations have pointed out, we need to change behavior that is causing grave civilian harm. This declaration could be a starting point to do that, but only if it goes beyond restating existing obligations and commits states to undertake policies and practices that put civilian protection at the forefront. Humanitarian needs have been sacrificed to so-called military necessity for far too long. We have a chance to save lives with this declaration, and we must take this responsibility seriously. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker on the list is Switzerland. As of this minute, that's the last speaker on our list, so I'm sure there will be some more. Anyway, Switzerland, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, sir. Section 3
Thank you, Chair.
includes some of the main practical and policy commitments of the declaration. It is thus of particular importance, as we see reflected in the strong commitment of many delegations in their comments on this section. Our delegation believes that Section 3, as is the case for other parts of the text, has been significantly improved compared to the previous consultation cycle. As many have pointed out, 3.3 is essential both to this section and for the declaration as a whole. It is important for this paragraph to give clear orientations as to how we want to see practice evolve in the field, and at the same time that it be effectively implementable by the military there. These considerations, it will be very difficult to meet everyone's concerns, but we believe that 3.3, as worded in the revised draft, it strikes a good balance, or the best possible balance, between these positions. If we could think of other wordings, we nonetheless think that we ought not at this stage to stray too far from what we have before us at present. As we said in our initial statement, Switzerland is convinced that it is necessary to have a strong political statement which is broadly supported, including by states with operational relevant military experience. Only in that way will the declaration lead to a specific difference in the field. And this is particularly important for the operational section, which includes follow-up mechanisms and political points, which, as we've said in your statement initially, sir, the beginning of a process rather than the end. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Merci.
Thank you.
Floor next to Plowshares.
Thank you very much, Chair. We note that the current draft of the political declaration calls for better compliance with existing norms, including international humanitarian law. But the need to comply with existing norms, including IHL, is self-evident and should be seen as an obvious minimum baseline for this process, not its ultimate objective. It is from this starting point that we seek to strengthen the protection of civilians in armed conflict, not simply to restate existing obligations. This process needs to add value to those existing obligations. We need to aim higher and do more than simply reiterate what is known. Assurances by some states that adequate mechanisms to protect civilians are already in place seem disconcertingly detached from the reality of extensive and systematic civilian suffering that continues to be well documented in armed conflicts around the world. While we recognize the value of a robust political declaration in its entirety, operative section 3 is where the greatest clarity is required to have a concrete impact in military policy and practice with the specific objective of minimizing civilian harm. When explosive weapons with wide area effects are used in populated areas, approximately 9 out of 10 casualties are civilian. This is a troubling trend that has held over time and across conflict zones. This constitutes a humanitarian emergency of the highest order and must translate to a strong operational commitment under 3.3. The text in 3.3 that reads, and I quote, when the effects may be expected to extend beyond a military objective, end quote, gives the impression that these effects are hypothetical or extraordinary, when in reality, they are persistent and widespread. Moreover, the current wording that says, and I quote, restricting or refraining from can lend itself to significant ambiguity. On the one hand, it may give the impression that states will have a choice between either restricting or refraining, which is clearly not the intent here. On the other, the concepts of restricting and refraining from may be read to be synonymous when they are clearly not. The highest possible standard to advance the humanitarian objectives of this declaration would be achieved through a clear commitment not to use explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. Why? Again, because when explosive weapons are used in populated areas, 9 out of 10 casualties are civilian. Relevant military policy and practice must therefore be guided by a presumption of non-use or an avoidance policy. We support INU's earlier statement, which calls on states to avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated area and to reflect this commitment in paragraph 3.3. The international community should aspire to a norm of non-use, whereby any deviations would be highly exceptional and in any case would require solid and sufficient mitigating measures intended to minimize civilian harms. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Friends World Committee for Consultation, to be followed by OCHA. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. In 3.1, we suggest the removal of where necessary, as it is necessary to continue to improve national policy in response to growing understandings of harm and ways to prevent it. Also within 3.1, we suggest addition of national control mechanisms with regard to the transfer of arms, recognizing that the protection of civilians is directly linked to arms proliferation, and inclusion of national control mechanisms will strengthen efforts to mitigate and avoid civilian harm that supports the focus of national policy in this paragraph. In 3.3, we welcome the addition of refraining from use of explosive weapons that has the greatest impact to protecting civilians and reducing harm. In its current drafting, this paragraph frames the implementation for armed forces only. We suggest this needs broadening to beyond our armed forces to fully strengthen refraining from the use of explosive weapons. We also suggest an explicit focus on which mechanisms or entities guide the implementation of this, such as the Armed Trade Treaty. In line with the above, we suggest a new 3.4 based on our suggestions in Section 1 that would strengthen this declaration in its aim to foster behavioural change and strengthen commitment to IHL. It would read, and I quote exact verbatim from HRC Res 4120, which reads, urges all states to refrain from transferring arms when they assess, in accordance with applicable national procedures and international obligations and standards, that there is a clear risk that such arms might be used in the commission or facilitation of serious violations or abuses of international human rights law or serious violations of international humanitarian law. In 3.6, we suggest adding after international humanitarian law a reference to international human rights law, which is in line with the rationale existing language in section 2.1. Finally, we suggest a new 3.8, recognizing the need for strengthened efforts on the prevention and diversion of explosive weapons, which would read, ensure that states commit to strengthening efforts on prevention and diversion of explosive weapons in the export and import chain, as all arms transfers and acquisitions have impacts on civilians and human rights, recognizing that diversion has been identified as one of the main sources of supply to non-state actors. We will send exact language in writing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor now to Ocha, to be followed by Minds Action Group and New Zealand. Ocha, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And on behalf of the 8 UN entities I mentioned yesterday, I would like to share our reading of Section 3 of the draft declaration and provide our suggestions for this section, notably focusing my intervention on paragraph 3.3. This provision, in our view, really constitutes the core of the declaration, and it is important to get it right. And if we want this declaration to help trigger meaningful change on the ground, we believe that it should go well beyond simply repeating existing IHL obligations. The United Nations Secretary General has called very clearly for several years for states to commit to avoid the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. This has been echoed with different parties, including the ICRC, including African states in the 2017 Maputo communique, and Latin American and Caribbean states in the 2018 Santiago communique, as well as by many civil society organizations. Many have repeated their positions today in this consultation. Therefore, we would like to suggest the following amendments to paragraph 3.3. First, we should make clear that states should avoid the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated area. We would also suggest to delete, and I quote, when effects may be expected, end of quote, as it implies that the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas may not extend beyond military objectives. Evidence at our disposals clearly suggests otherwise. And finally, we would also suggest to delete in accordance with IHL, which would limit this provision to the stated to obligations, to existing obligation under IHL. So if I can summarize the paragraph we suggest would read as follows. Ensure that our armed forces adopt and implement a range of policies and practices to avoid civilian harm, including by avoiding the use of explosive weapons in populated areas with wide area effects. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Mag, followed by New Zealand.
Thank you, Chair. I will outline some shorter recommendations now, and I have already shared some more detailed wording suggestions in our written submission. Paragraph 3.3 should be at the start of the operative section as the core commitment of the declaration. A commitment to avoid the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas would provide the greatest protection to civilians and would reduce the potential contamination with explosive ordnance and the subsequent risks associated with it. The reference to explosive weapons with wide area effects should be added back into this paragraph. Explosive ordnance is a secondary effect of the use of a WIPA with onward reverberating effects, including accidents, impeding safe movement of IDPs and refugees, and blocking rubble removal, reconstruction, and restoration of key services. MAG welcomes the commitment to address reverberating effects in paragraph 3.4. This should be further strengthened by stating that armed forces should specifically assess and take steps to mitigate the different foreseeable effects rather than simply taking them into account. MAG also supports the removal of the reference to battle damage assessments in paragraph 3.4 and including instead a separate commitment for armed forces to establish the necessary capacity to track civilian harm, including casualties and damage to civilian objects. In addition to the learning opportunities for tactical, operational, and policy responses, civilian harm data can inform the prioritization and response of mine action organizations, especially in the immediate aftermath of conflict, before communities have returned, when information of the potential location of explosive ordnance is limited. We welcome paragraph 3.5, which calls for clearance of explosive ordnance. The pace of clearance is slower and more resource intensive in populated areas, as it often requires mechanical assets to process unsafe rubble, and clearance has to be conducted in 3 dimensions in multi-story buildings. MAG's experience in Iraq shows that clearance of explosive ordnance in urban settings is 6 times more expensive than similar work done in rural areas. Until clearance is complete, risk education is the only activity that can protect civilians from the explosive threat. Therefore, MAG calls for the provision of risk education to affected populations to be included in paragraph 3.5, alongside marking, clearance, removal, and destruction of explosive ordnance. While humanitarian clearance should begin as soon as possible after the end of active hostilities, risk education can and should be delivered as soon as the use of explosive weapons is confirmed, including through remote means such as radio and social media that allow safety messages to reach communities even when conflict prevents direct access. So in order to keep this paragraph simple and relevant for both clearance and risk education, we propose removing the phrase as soon as possible after the end of active hostilities. Finally, in addition to the provisions on clearance and risk education, we also call on states to record, retain, and share the location, number, and type of explosive weapons used in populated areas. This would facilitate the planning and efficiency of the mine action response, and it would save lives. Considering the direct relevance of this commitment to the clearance of explosive ordnance, and also in order to heed the call from Norway to keep the declaration short, we suggest also considering adding this in paragraph 3.5. So if I may, I will just read quickly our proposal for paragraph 3.5, which is ensure the marking, clearance, and removal of or destruction of explosive ordnance, along with the provision of risk education to affected populations, semicolon, to facilitate the rapid delivery of these activities, ensure the recording and sharing of information on the location, number, and type of explosive weapons used with national mine action authorities or other responsible agencies, the United Nations, and non-governmental organizations. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to New Zealand, to be followed by Civic. New Zealand, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. We are now at the heart of our discussions, and we appreciate the careful way you have brought us to this point, and note your request to delegations to be as ambitious and flexible as possible in building bridges across remaining differences in this section. We have the following suggestions to improve the text further. On paragraph 3.1, we support a specific reference to the use of explosive weapons as Chile and Mexico have suggested, as well as referring specifically to the protection of civilians after armed conflict. On paragraph 3.2, we have reviewed and endorsed the suggestions put forward by the ICRC. Firstly, again, this includes a specific reference to populated areas. Secondly, it includes a clear demarcation between IHL and policy commitments. And thirdly, it includes a reference to armed forces being given means to conduct hostilities in populated areas in a manner that will minimize the risk of civilian harm. On 3.3, we want to see convergence based largely on the current formulation and have been prepared to demonstrate flexibility on this point. The current formulation, restrict or refrain, strikes us as a reasonable compromise in this regard, and our thanks to the pen holders for suggesting this potential solution. Also on 3.3, we would prefer to see the final clause deleted for clarity's sake, which refers to acting in accordance with IHL. This clause is unnecessary in our view. At the same time, it is potentially confusing. On 3.4, we support the recommendations of INU and several others on this paragraph to further strengthen the commitment by clearly stating that armed forces should specifically assess and take steps to mitigate any foreseeable effects, rather than simply taking them into account. And finally, on 3.6, we wish to see a specific reference to the commitments from the declaration being disseminated to the parties of armed conflict. We look forward to continuing a discussion on these issues over the next day or so. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor now to Civic, to be followed by Israel and then Canada. Civic, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Civic has submitted written recommendations, and I'd just like to point out just a couple of areas for today's comments. On para 3.1, we recommend extending protection to civilians both during and after armed conflict, because harm caused by explosive weapons in populated areas lasts beyond the duration of armed conflict. On para 3.2, Civic recommends adding language to strengthen training contextualized to urban areas, which is the most challenging given density of population, terrain, and infrastructure. Based on our on-the-ground engagement with armed actors, significant gap exists in factoring in risk to civilians and civilian objects during urban operations. Specifically, we recommend adding language such as ensuring comprehensive scenario-based trainings on international humanitarian law and on the measures and good practices adapted to the challenges of urban areas, including means and methods to minimize risk to civilians and civilian objects during the conduct of hostilities. On para 3.3, Civic supports language in the declaration for states to commit to adopt policies and practices that will protect civilians from the effects of explosive weapons. The language refraining or restricting use of explosive weapons, however, falls short of the action needed to protect civilians, as it gives parties to conflict options of choosing to refrain or restrict on the use of such weapons. Civic supports the call of the ICRC and the Secretary General of the United Nations, as well as a number of states urging commitments to avoid the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. We therefore recommend using language to avoid using explosive weapons and to add with wide area effects in populated areas, unless sufficient mitigation measures can be taken to limit their wide area effects and risk of civilian harm. We also recommend removing qualifiers such as in accordance with IHL, as it creates confusion on existing legal obligations and policy commitments. On paragraph 3.4 on planning and assessment of civilian harm, we think it can better reflect the goals of this political declaration. Again, based on our engagement with militaries through trainings and development of civilian harm mitigation tools and practices, Civic recommends including the more comprehensive post-strike assessment and tracking of civilian harm, and not just battle damage assessment. We have found that the purpose of initial battle damage assessment is to assess targeting of a military objective and not discovering civilian harm, and has been known to miss civilian deaths based, again, on our analysis of examining military investigation reports. We also recommend linking such a tool as a way to support the commitments mentioned in the declaration on policies, lessons learned, and accountability mechanism, and correlated to paragraph 1.6. We have submitted language for consideration on this point. Finally, we have seen the effectiveness of civilian harm tracking tools to inform mitigation measures and reduction of civilian harm. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor now to Israel, to be followed by Canada. Israel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. Regarding the chapeau, we suggest adding a reference to the right of states to defend themselves, as it is an important aspect of the protection of civilians. Also, this will more appropriately reflect the balance between military necessity and humanitarian considerations, a crucial issue that has been mentioned by other delegations. We would suggest adding this to the end of the chapeau of the operative sections, so that it would read, addressing the humanitarian consequences arising from armed conflict involving the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, while bearing in mind the right of states to defend themselves and their citizens. Regarding 3.3, as previously mentioned, we believe that this declaration should strictly remain within the legal consensus and the parameters of existing IHL, in order to remain universally inclusive and legally accurate. This is an extremely problematic paragraph, as its current wording introduces legal standards which do not exist in IHL. Likewise, the text seems to erroneously conflate the principles of distinction and proportionality. We firmly believe that the text should stick to existing law. We found the French delegation's suggestion to be very interesting. We support deleting the sentence when the effects may be expected to extend beyond a military objective, as they proposed, and would suggest another small modification, replacing the words in accordance with where required, so that it would read, ensure that our armed forces adopt and implement a range of policies and practices to avoid civilian harm, including by restricting or refraining from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas where required by international humanitarian law. Regarding 3.4, we suggest changing the words can reasonably be foreseen to the words are reasonably expected in order to better align this text with the requirements of IHL. Lastly, as previously mentioned, we would request replacing the words reverberating effects with indirect effects. And regarding paragraph 3.6, we are of the view that respect for and implementation of IHL is of the highest importance. However, a cautious approach should be taken regarding the commitment by states to promote the respect and implementation of IHL by other states, as well as by non-state armed groups. Therefore, we would suggest adding the word as appropriate before the word promote, as it reflects a more realistic approach and takes into account various complexities. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor next to Canada.
Thank you very much, Chair. First, we appreciate how difficult it is for Ireland to strike the right balance in Section 3 with so many competing views attempting to achieve the goal of protecting civilian persons and objects. As we have already indicated, we will provide written comments following this meeting. We have also already expressed our concern regarding the term reverberating effects used in paragraph 3.4, which is not defined in international law. Therefore, in this intervention, we will focus our comments on paragraphs 3.3 and 3.6. On 3.3, although a political declaration does not carry the binding force of law, any policy it creates that extends beyond what is required by existing IHL would have the effect of creating different objective standards for parties and non-parties to such a declaration. The armed conflict in Ukraine is just one prominent example demonstrating that military necessity may well dictate the employment of means and methods of warfare that include explosive weapons in populated areas, and a presumption against their use would unnecessarily tie the hands of armed forces that are committed to fighting by the rules. Allowing a state that routinely violates IHL to stigmatize another state for the lawful use of such weapons in its defense might serve to undermine the intent of the declaration. It would also allow the possibility to create a false equivalency between parties to armed conflict and make every effort to comprehensively integrate IHL into their military decision-making process, and those that routinely violate the law because they lack the willingness to comply in the first instance. Creating a presumption of non-use of explosive weapons in populated areas does not give due regard to the existing precautions that IHL already articulates, the obligation to take constant care to spare the civilian population, civilians, and civilian objects, and the requirement to take all feasible precautions to avoid and in any event to minimize incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof. Along similar lines, in the second half of 3.3, the reference to effects that, quote, may be expected to extend beyond a military objective, close quote, is vague and unknown to IHL. We strongly recommend employing the terminology of AP1 accurately. Given our stance that this declaration should accurately reflect IHL, 3.6 is extremely important. As the ICRC has acknowledged, if properly interpreted and applied, IHL offers strong protection to civilians. We have, on one hand, a horrifying number of civilian casualties and moonscapes resulting from certain prominent armed conflicts. If we look closely at the wreckage of those cities and the means and methods employed, it is clear that those parties are not abiding by the fundamentals of IHL governing the conduct of hostilities. This may be a question of willingness to implement, or a question of inability to do so effectively. But either way, IHL is the universally agreed standard that is not being attained. The ICRC has produced an extensively researched study called The Roots of Restraint in War, which reaffirms that the behavior of armed forces is dependent on the orders they receive. The training alone that they receive is insufficient. And IHL needs to be integrated into the policy, doctrine, education, training, military decision-making, and disciplinary systems of armed forces in order to reflect compliance. The law, it affirms, is only as strong as the willingness of parties to carry out that process of integration. There is no credible evidence that IHL, when interpreted in good faith and integrated thoroughly into operational practice, is in any way insufficient to address the preponderance of humanitarian concerns tragically observed in modern armed conflict. What this declaration may strongly support through paragraph 3.6 is a detailed and effective integration of IHL into military practice. That would be a major added value of this policy statement. In summary, Canada does not support the creation of a new standard regarding the use of weapons. The underlying problem is not a lack of good law, but a lack of good implementation. We will endorse a text that adequately reflects these central concerns. And we thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor next to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. My delegation would like to speak on paragraph 3.3, emphasizing the need to be in accordance with international humanitarian law. Among others, my delegation has trouble interpreting the parts when the effects may be expected to expand beyond a military objective. This difficulty of understanding exacerbated by the claim regarding the relationship between humanitarian consequences and the use of explosive weapons stated in the title, section 1, and again the shuffle of part B. Several delegations mentioned humanitarian consequences always arise when you use explosive weapons, regardless of its types and impacts. In doing so, the current drafting implicitly stigmatizes the use of explosive weapons as a whole and may impose additionally higher standards. Going back to the paragraph 3.3 again with these backgrounds, my delegation is compelled to interpret that effects beyond a military objective always expected to happen. Therefore, countries are faced with automatically triggered commitments under 3.3, including the use of explosive weapons. Finally, in order to avoid other possible confusions, my delegations reiterates the importance of sticking to existing international law. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson.
Thank you very much. Now, the floor remains open for any further interventions. We don't actually have on the list, but I see United States, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And we've been listening with great interest to the discussion so far, and a very interesting debate. And we've heard some new proposals, some of which we don't think will get us there, but others may offer some interesting possibilities. In any case, Mr. Chair, we're very glad to join the discussion on Section 3. And as others have said, this section, along with Section 4, are the operative sections of the Declaration. Both of these two sections could have real impacts if they promote realistic and practical measures that can really improve protections for civilians. As the U.S. delegation and many other delegations have expressed in this and in prior sessions in our discussions of this declaration, Section 3.3 raises serious concerns. If Section 3.3 doesn't reflect IHL and operational realities, it could prevent the United States and possibly other states that are currently engaged in armed conflict or who have extensive recent experience of armed conflict from being able to join the declaration. It's not feasible or realistic in combat generally to restrict or refrain from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas whenever, quote, as 3.3 now says, quote, the effects may be expected to extend beyond a military objective, unquote. As reflected in the broad conception of harm outlined in Section 1, which we've had a great deal of discussion on, the direct and indirect effects of explosive weapons, like many other weapons, would likely always extend in some ways beyond the military objective. This is particularly true when we think of all the different elements of indirect harm that are already in the draft declaration or that have been proposed to add to it. Think of things like psychosocial effects. And in some cases, militaries may intentionally use explosive weapons to achieve effects beyond the specific military objective being targeted as part of an attack. This could include trying to cause effects on other military objectives not being directly targeted. For example, an attack might include the use of explosive weapons to crater a choke point in a road to impede the advance of an enemy force. Not only would this part of the attack cause effects beyond what may be considered the most immediate, quote, military objective, which is the choke point being targeted, but doing so might achieve the intended effect of stopping the enemy advance while also resulting in less collateral damage than attacking the enemy force directly. This type of operation would also obviously affect civilians who might want to use the road. Given these concerns, it's difficult to see how paragraph 3.3, as it's currently drafted, would be workable in practice, especially because its implementation might be inconsistent with the commander's effort to use explosive weapons to minimize civilian casualties in the context of specific military operations. However, we do understand and we appreciate that many delegations feel strongly that Section 3.3 should not simply repeat existing IHL requirements and should move us beyond what IHL requires. We agreed that this should be possible and can incorporate some of the core language of this existing draft. Our delegation has proposed the following. Ensure that our armed forces adopt and implement a range of policies and practices to help avoid civilian harm, including where feasible by restricting or refraining from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas when their use may be expected to cause harm to civilians or civilian objects. Obviously, we've submitted this and other proposals, or we will in writing. A few notes about this language. First, unfortunately, and we hear people say, oh, we must have an avoidance principle, but unfortunately, it is impossible to avoid all civilian harm during armed conflict. We have to be realistic. So we need to add language for critical flexibility, recognizing that the use of explosive weapons may, in some circumstances, be the best option to achieve a military effect, and or the option that poses the least risk to civilians. Second, along the same lines, there will almost always be some expected effect that extends beyond a military objective during armed conflict. If this was the red line standard adopted by Section 3.3, the use of explosive weapons in populated areas would effectively be restricted in all circumstances. Our modified language suggestion would retain the thrust of the paragraph by focusing on the harm caused to civilians and civilian objects, which is ultimately what should be the core of this declaration. Third, the new language that was proposed in this revised draft at the end of the clause, quote, in accordance with international humanitarian law, must be removed, as Section 3.3, even with our proposed edits, goes well beyond what IHL requires. And we also take the point that other delegations have said that as drafted, that reference to in accordance with international humanitarian law could be interpreted in different ways and is unclear. Mr. Chairman, let me also turn to section 3.4, which also requires key edits in our estimation. As we discussed in our intervention on section 1, the term, quote, reverberating effects is not used in IHL. There's no common understanding of its meaning or its scope of application. If states are committing in this section to take into account the effects on civilians and civilian objects, there must be a clear understanding of which effects states, and specifically the commanders on the battlefield, should consider and how the concept is to be applied. Therefore, reverberating effects must be replaced with indirect effects in section 3.4. And we actually have heard delegations from across the spectrum of views who have made the same proposal. In addition, the first clause of section 3.4 should state, ensure in their policies and practices to more closely link section 3.4 to section 3.3, which relates to the adoption and implementation of policies and practices. Lastly, with respect to the new language about battle damage assessments, we've heard a lot of criticism of that reference, and we agree that such assessments are an important concept to include in section 3.4, but don't necessarily cover everything. However, and I think the French have pointed this out, battle damage assessments are typically not a vehicle leading directly to lessons learned. We therefore recommend that the last clause of section 3 read, and identify lessons learned, which is the same proposal made by the delegation from France. This would delink the battlefield assessments from lessons learned. Finally, in section 3.5, on marking, clearance, and removal or destruction of explosive remnants of war, we recommend replacing, quote, as possible with, quote, as feasible. This would mirror the language in Article 3.2 of Protocol 5 of the CCW. As in other sections of this declaration, we do not seek to change or expand existing IHL when restating it. And we do not think that it was the intent of this section. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. And there is another speaker on the list at the moment. That's Belgium. Belgium, you have the floor.
Mr. Chairman, we have two comments regarding section 3 of the text. And as many have mentioned, this is the core of the text, and we appreciate how difficult it is to strike the correct balance. On paragraph 3.3, we repeat that our position is that the declaration should not imply the creation of a new rule under international humanitarian law. The important principles of distinction, proportionality, precaution, and necessity constitute a balanced equilibrium between humanitarian considerations on the one hand and military necessity on the other hand. In this regard, we would like to repeat a suggestion of the suggested language that was previously made by Belgium, which reads, policies and practices to avoid and in any event minimize civilian harm when conducting an attack, including by restricting or refraining from the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas, when the effects may be expected to extend beyond a military objective and are likely to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. In the spirit of compromise, the following alternative language could also be considered as an alternative. To add at the end of the current para the word existing, so it will read in accordance with existing IHL. We also suggest to add in the first line of this para the word or in any event minimize, and when conducting an attack, so it will read avoid or in any event minimize civilian harm when conducting an attack. On para 3.4, we also repeat our comment on reverberating effects that was mentioned for the previous sections, which we would like to see replaced by indirect effects. Finally, we would suggest to add to this para based on available information at the time, after which can be reasonably foreseen. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor next to Article 36.
Article 36 supports the comments provided by INU and would like to share specific observations on the commitments contained in paragraphs 3.3 and 3.4 of the draft declaration. As others have mentioned, the commitment in 3.3 is at the heart of the declaration. Like others, we would recommend that it be strengthened to promote a presumption against the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas, such as a commitment to avoid such use, as this would have the greatest impact in preventing civilian harm. It would also be very important for the declaration to provide guidance to states on the specific steps required to implement the commitments in paragraphs 3.3 and 3.4. The implementation of the commitment in 3.3 to adopt and implement policies and practices to avoid civilian harm, including by restricting or refraining from, or we would prefer avoiding the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects, would necessarily involve a number of practical steps that should be articulated in the declaration. As well as providing practical guidance, such elaboration might also serve to alleviate some of the anxieties that seem to characterize the positions of certain states on this commitment. First, military should undertake prior assessment of the technical characteristics of explosive weapons to ensure a proper understanding of the scale of area effects that are possible in different operational conditions. Understanding the effects of explosive weapons, including their area effects, is a vital building block to policies that can reduce civilian harm. Second, military should undertake assessments of the operational context, including both the generic urban environment as well as the specific context of use, and how this will influence the scale and nature of area effects of the weapon. Being able to assess the effects of the weapon in conjunction with an understanding of the military objective in a specific context is another key building block to better protect civilians. It is when the effects of the weapon extend beyond or occur outside the intended military objective that we see wide area effects in practice, effects that in a populated area will predictably fall upon the civilian population. This is the central cause of harm that we are working to avoid. Third, military should review and further develop their doctrine, operational policies, and procedures to ensure that these technical assessments of weapons and their effects and the assessment of contextual factors are reflected in and inform operational planning and decision-making as well as training. By including these specific considerations and actions in the declaration, which are aimed at ensuring an understanding of the effects of explosive weapons, including the scale of their area effects and the urban context of use, and how this affects weapon performance, the declaration would establish clear policy requirements that are vital to the protection of civilians in practice. As concerns the commitments in 3.4, to take into account, or we would recommend, assess and mitigate the direct and reverberating effects on civilians and civilian objects, implementation of this commitment would necessarily involve the following actions. First, the military's review existing operational policies and procedures to ensure that the actual or presumed presence of civilians and civilian objects, such as essential infrastructure, as well as foreseeable reverberating effects, are properly accounted for in operational planning and decision-making. Where this is not the case, states should develop and implement the necessary policies and procedures, including through consultation with subject matter experts. We would note again that taking these wider effects into account, assessing them and mitigating them, is not asking states to know the unknowable. Rather, it is encouraging us to give broad consideration to the harms that people experience in conflict, because these harms are real and it is civilians that bear the brunt of them. The declaration is not imposing new legal obligations, but it is asking states to have the confidence to take into account the broader challenges that civilians face, in particular where elements of interconnected infrastructure are destroyed. Second, implementation of the commitment in 3.4 should also include concerted efforts by militaries to properly understand the actual impact of their operations and the use of explosive weapons on civilians. In this regard, we note the reference in 3.4 to the conduct of battle damage assessments to identify lessons learned. However, battle damage assessments, as others have pointed out, are a specific practice that is principally intended to understand the impact of an attack on the target and to make recommendations for further attacks. Our research and that of others has consistently found that battle damage assessments are not regularly used or suitable for providing a comprehensive understanding of the impact of military operations on the civilian population that would, importantly, support changes to tactics, lessons learned, and broader policy development in support of more effective protection of civilians. We would recommend deleting the reference to battle damage assessments and include instead a commitment to civilian casualty tracking, that is to say, a commitment to establish the necessary capabilities to track in real time, analyze and respond to, and crucially learn from incidents of civilian harm and damage to civilian objects resulting from military operations and the use of explosive weapons. Civilian casualty tracking is not a new practice, and it has proven utility for armed forces, as indeed recognized in the preamble. A commitment to establish the necessary capacity for civilian casualty tracking would reflect and build on recent developments in military policy and practice towards greater predictability and consistency in understanding, responding to, and learning from harm to civilians and damage to civilian objects, and would significantly contribute to strengthening the protection of civilians. To conclude, the main direction of our comments here is to encourage states to see these commitments as promoting concrete practical actions, rather than to view them as akin to legal obligations. This should be quite clear from the way the text is currently framed, pointing at 3.3 as it does to the adoption of policies and practices. We see the adoption of strong commitments here as critical to showing that this community is working seriously to improve the protection of civilians. We will submit these comments and specific text suggestions in writing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to Denmark.
As this is the first time I'm taking the floor, I would like to start by thanking Ireland for your leadership on this important political declaration. Before addressing our main comments to Section 3, I also want to take this opportunity to say that Denmark fully aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union yesterday. As has already been addressed by many other delegations, the purpose of this declaration is not to create new rules, but rather to secure and enhance compliance with the IHL through the declaration's envisioned follow-up process, which shall allow for further international cooperation through exchanges of information and best practices. Against this background, we propose to amend Section 3.3 and 3.4 to align with the IHL terminology to avoid ambiguity in these provisions. We therefore propose that the sentence, when the effects may be expected to extend beyond a military objective in Section 3.3 is replaced with wording referring to indiscriminate attacks, or alternative that this text is omitted and that the provision instead solely refers to in accordance with the IHL. We also propose to omit the use of the term reverberating effects in Section 3.4 and rather use incidental or indirect effects, which many other delegations have already commented on. We would also propose to replace the wording can reasonably be foreseen by the terminology from IHL, which may be expected instead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I give the floor now to Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As noted by many other delegations, Section 3 is probably the key of this political declaration. And as pointed out during our remarks on Section 1, the scoping of the political declaration, as is done in Section 1, is closely linked to the policy commitments to be agreed here. From the Netherlands perspective, it must be clear that the undertaking in Section 3.3 is a policy commitment aimed at enhancing the protection of civilians, which is based on our commitment to the strict implementation and adherence to IHL. Thus, IHL should be the basis on which such a policy decision is based, and this should be clear in this paragraph. Second, as noted in our comments on Section 1, explosive weapons cover a broad range of different types of weapon systems which have different impacts due to their different yields, accuracy, and number of munitions. It is important to specify this in paragraph 3.3, which type of explosive weapons should be avoided when operated in populated areas. Allow me to underline here that for the Netherlands, a political commitment to restrain or refrain from using explosive weapons should be aimed specifically at those explosive weapons that, due to their explosive power or lack of accuracy or the number of munitions, can have effects that may be expected to extend the military objective. Therefore, in the spirit of compromise, the Netherlands suggests two small amendments to paragraph 3.3 as follows. We would start with, in accordance with IHL, and then we would continue with the text as it is, ensure that our armed forces adopt and implement a range of policy and practices to avoid civilian harm, including by restricting or refraining from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas when the effects may be expected to extend beyond the military objective. And then we would add, due to the weapon's explosive power or lack of accuracy or the number of munitions, full stop. Of course, we will send these comments in writing. In closing, allow me to also briefly circle back to paragraph 3.2, where we would like to echo the ICR's comments that this paragraph should reflect that to train armed forces in IHL is a clear and existing IHL obligation, whereas the second part of the sentence is again a policy decision. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. We do not have any more speakers on our list, but it may be that some delegations would wish to still intervene. I'll just look around the room to see. No, it doesn't. Oh, United Kingdom, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought I'd jump straight in there. Too much of a delay there, my apologies. So section 3, this is, of course, the most important section and one where we've already seen some very healthy and extensive debate. It's only right that the lion's share of the agenda has been allotted to it. Conflict, especially in urban areas, poses risks to civilians. And that is one reason why conflict prevention and resolution are so important. But there are circumstances where there is no alternative to conducting military operations, including operations in urban areas. And there are circumstances where the hostilities and the approach to hostilities which is adopted are necessary to protect civilians. We must work to minimize the risks that arise from such action. Turning to let me be plain that we cannot support paragraph 3.3 as currently drafted. However, we're confident that we can find a form of words that is acceptable to all, and it's vital that we do so. As we mentioned earlier, I'd like to make it very clear that for us, a key factor of this work isn't just the text, but what comes after it. That is exactly how the protection of civilians can be tangibly improved, and we want to be involved in that process. Our armed forces, however, must be able to operate always within the confines of IHL to counter those who deliberately operate within urban environments. The text, as it stands, would hinder our ability to do so. We recognise that many in this room view the specific words of avoid, restrict, or refrain as being important to this paragraph. They can be acceptable, but they need to be used in such a way that takes into account legitimate military imperatives and the realities of armed conflict. Sometimes, military action designed to bring a conflict or threat to a swift resolution can protect civilians in the long run. A full avoidance of, or placing restrictions on, the use of explosive weapons would prevent our ability to achieve this. Importantly, it wouldn't tackle the issue of those who don't have such policies or practices in place to avoid this. And it wouldn't address the problem of those who already fail to comply with IHL. Wording to acknowledge that we will avoid or restrict or refrain where feasible is therefore vital. The object of why we're meeting is the protection of civilians. It's therefore crucial that the paragraph is grounded on the prevention of civilian harm, and it's right that the paragraph focuses on the policies and practices that are needed to do so. Although this is the clear purpose of IHL, linking the text to compliance with or acting in accordance with IHL runs a risk of clouding the issue and introducing different interpretations of the paragraph. We therefore recommend that it's deleted. The same is true of text about effects extending beyond military objectives, as my US colleagues have mentioned. With regards to specific wording of the paragraph, we can be flexible, to a degree, of course, on how this is achieved, but the wording must not create obligations or commitments that extend beyond IHL. Secondly, and this is the point that comes back to the issues that we raised during sections 1 and 4, the use of the term reverberating effects within paragraph 3.4 is a significant concern. For the reasons outlined in our intervention this morning, the term makes the scope of the paragraph unclear, potentially requiring unrealistic foresight on behalf of our armed forces when planning or conducting operations on an unclear set of possible effects. As a result, and in line with many other delegations who have raised similar reservations, we suggest reverberating is replaced with indirect. We would also suggest starting the paragraph by linking it to 3.3 and beginning it with ensure in their policies and practices. Finally, on this section, and as appropriate, is required at the beginning of paragraph 3.5 to make it clear that these obligations aren't universal. An alternative would be to place it at the end of the chapeau before the section. In the same vein, the hour towards the end of the paragraph needs to be removed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor next to Germany.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We recognize that the application of IHL can pose considerable challenges when using explosive weapons in populated areas. That is in particular true for the application of the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution in the event of an attack. As the draft declaration recognizes, many armed forces already today implement operational policies and practices designed to avoid and in any event minimize civilian harm. There are various national and international handbooks on the matter, such as NATO's The Protection of Civilians Allied Command Operations Handbook, that aims at building a strong protection of civilians approach. We believe that it is of paramount importance to focus on strengthening such policies and practices. We are convinced that we can substantially improve the protection of civilians from the harm stemming from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas by systematically comparing and exchanging the existing national and international approaches by developing a compilation or toolbox of good practices. This toolbox could then be used as a basis for trainings and exchanges with interested armed forces to provide additional certainty on how to best protect civilians when conducting military operations and therefore lead to an effective change on the ground. Para 3.3, as has been sufficiently underlined by many delegations, including my own, is obviously a pivotal part of the declaration. It has a particular relevance for states with active military operations, whose participation in this process will be vital for the effectiveness of the declaration, both with regard to implementing its commitments in their own military policies and procedures, but also when it comes to the pivotal sharing of military good practices that we discussed under Section 4. We therefore appeal to all participants to bear this in mind when discussing this paragraph in an inclusive manner and keep a focus on the draft text and the group of potential subscribers to ensure an effective declaration and follow-on process that can really reduce civilian harm on the ground. We appeal to all participants to exert maximum willingness to compromise and will do so ourselves. So at this stage, we will not add to your burden of weighing different proposals to bring about more convergence on this difficult paragraph. Its pivotal role notwithstanding, paragraph 3.3 should not be looked at in an isolated manner. Rather, paragraph 3.3 formulates the core principle of the declaration, that is, adopting and implementing policies and practices to avoid civilian harm. Paragraph 3.4 then specifies that also this means taking into account direct and indirect or reverberating effects when planning military operations and executing attacks, including battle damage assessments to the degree feasible. And paragraph 3.5 refers to the stage after an attack with regard to explosive remnants of war. In Germany's view, the trinity of paragraph 3.3, 3.4, and 3.5 adequately reflects a commitment that also takes into account the effects of an attack that are not direct. As some delegations have pointed out that they are not comfortable with referring to the notion of reverberating effects, we propose to refer to indirect effects in paragraph 3.4 instead. It is our impression that the notion of indirect effects is an already widespread and applied concept. As already presented during our statement on section 4, we believe that we would benefit from a systematic comparison and exchange on the notion of foreseeable indirect effects in the context of the follow-up process to this declaration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I just want to see, are there any more interventions at this point? And I think probably not at this point. No, I'll take it that we don't have any more interventions. So that brings us today to the end of our run through the whole draft political declaration. And I think we have managed this time to have a really detailed discussion and examination of the whole declaration from start to finish. I'm aware that in the past we didn't quite manage that, but we have, I suppose, a number of just broad conclusions. I think I can say that I am we are very, very heartened by the commitment to this process. And I really detect in the room a strong commitment to having a political declaration that as many as possible can sign up to. And to be honest, we wouldn't necessarily have said that when we opened the process several years ago. So we really feel at this point this very strong commitment. Obviously, there are points on which there has been some convergence, points on which parties are coming closer to each other, and then other points, as we've seen, especially in this last discussion, where there are still clear divergences. But I think the combination of the spirit and commitment to the process and to achieving a delegation that can actually mean something in people's lives, and the different proposals emerging on how we might bridge gaps gives us good hope. So what I would propose that we do is we have tomorrow also, and the way we would like to use tomorrow is I'd like, rather than sitting in this room in the morning and repeating what we've said or what we've said, I'd like to use tomorrow morning for consultations, and then to with you, and then to resume at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, where we can assess the best way forward. I mean, as I said at the start, our view is that our view was at the start that we would probably need just a little longer to get to that final draft for the political declaration. I would imagine that what we will conclude tomorrow, following our consultations, is that we have very good material to work on, with a view to concluding the process as soon as possible, which probably means, depending on room availability, in some 6 to 7 weeks, say 6 weeks, and that we would then, having met tomorrow, we would be able to work on the draft of what we would see as the final draft of the declaration, to be discussed with you over a day or a day and a half, maybe in early June. So hopefully that will work for all of you. I would add that tomorrow afternoon, when we meet at 3 o'clock, it will still be open to you to make interventions, because I know there are some colleagues who are still in discussions with their headquarters on some aspects of what we've been discussing in recent days. So we won't just meet to close discussions. We'll meet to review where we are and how we move forward, and to allow those of you who want to make final interventions to do so at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. But what we'll do tomorrow morning is we'll be holding consultations based on what we have heard over the last 2 days. So we'll be in touch with you, and you'll be in touch with us about how we use tomorrow morning to best effect. And then we'll see you back in this room at 3 o'clock in this format tomorrow afternoon. Thank you so much for the spirit of these consultations and for your interventions, and have a good evening, and see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.